Welcome and namaste, namaste, namaste. Today, we're in State College, Pennsylvania, the home of our favorite professor there, Professor Jeremy Engels, and we're talking all about his wonderful new book called Living Namaste. And of course, no word, concept, or book is really going to encompass what Namaste is, the lived experience of Namaste. But keep in mind that Dr. Jeremy is a professor of rhetoric there. And if anybody can do it, I think he can, but maybe not in the way that you're accustomed to. For Jeremy's book approaches Namaste from so many different directions and so many different angles, and you can see it from so many different sides that it almost does come alive. And perhaps one of my favorite words to describe Namaste is remembering. Not in the way that you forget something that you didn't recall before, but a literal embodied remembering where you're bringing parts, members, and remembering them back into a whole body. And I think that's kind of the sense that we're getting at here today. So without further ado, Professor Lynn Pardey and I invite you to join us in our bumper car meditation in Living Namaste with Dr. Jeremy. Well, Professor, I love the Bodhi leaf story, which sort of summarizes the whole book almost, doesn't it?
It does. Here it is. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh yeah.
How wonderful. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, we when I got back from India, I found someone who did like a professional archival kind of framing like they used to do for things from the 1800s. And so they preserved the leaf and made it look really nice. And so I get to look at that every morning and every time I'm sitting at my desk writing or planning class or doing a podcast. So yeah, that was a very powerful experience.
Yeah, maybe would you mind just sharing it a little bit? How you came to have such a valuable possession on your wall?
Sure. In 2018, I was really fortunate to go on a pilgrimage to walk in the footsteps of the Buddha, and it was organized by this wonderful international nonprofit called 11 Directions. They also go by Ahimsa Trust. And Shantam Seth, who's a longtime peace activist, he's probably the most senior lay student of Thich Nhat Hahn. He's the organizer of these visits. And it's a trip, actually, that Thich Nhat Hahn and others did, 40 years ago, I want to say, and traveling through India, visiting the sites where the Buddha was born and the Bodhi tree where he was enlightened and the Sarnath in the deer park where he gave the Four Noble Truths. And Anna, my wife, and I got to go on this pilgrimage with another dear friend of ours, and then with several monks and nuns from Thich Nhat Hanh's Blue Cliff Monastery in New York. And we had the chance to visit the Bodhi tree. It's not the original, obviously, though there's all kinds of mythology around it, which is quite interesting in and of itself. But there's a massive Bodhi tree that was planted probably 200 years ago, a beautiful, beautiful temple there honoring the place where the Buddha was enlightened. And we sat underneath the tree. We listened to the various groups of monks that were visiting from all over the world circumambulate the stupa, and they were chanting in at least 10 different languages. It was amazing. And there's this really interesting thing at Bodh Gaya where the temple is, where there's this just almost field of miniature temples. And you can walk through these little miniature temples. And I was doing that. I was walking around and I saw a man. He was dressed in full orange robes. His face was painted in the style of a Hindu renunciate. And, I walked up to him, and he pulled out this leaf that now is, matted above my desk. And he gave it to me. And rarely in the world does someone give you a free gift. There's often an implication or an expectation of something in return. And so I grabbed my little satchel to get some rupees to give to him. And he shook his head and he said, no, 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 no. And so I looked at him and I said, well, namaste. And his face just lit up when I said that. And he put his hand out on my heart and he said, namaste. And then he took my hand and put it on his heart and he said, namaste. And then he took his hands to heart center and bowed, and I did the same and said, namaste. And then he turned around and walked off, and I never saw him again. But that person and this amazing gift that he gave, and then this beautiful practice of connection have really stuck with me. And they're the inspiration for this book on Namaste.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe, I don't know where you'd like to start, but it seems that it's important, since namaste is not a word in English, that maybe we sort of unpack that a little bit about what that means and what the practice is, perhaps.
Sure. So namaste is a word that comes to us from Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit. It's a word that we see in some forms in the Upanishads, which are ancient philosophical texts in India. And literally, it's two words. Namas means I bow or I honor. And te is to you. And so namaste is literally a bowing or an honoring to another person. And in Hindi and in many associated languages that come from Sanskrit, but in many languages of Southeast Asia, namaste has become a greeting and also a parting. And so it's a word that can be said like ciao or maybe like aloha. It's a word that can mean both like hi and bye. And it's interesting actually how many of our greetings and our partings have some kind of religious roots. We say adios in Spanish or adieu in French, and literally that means to God. And it's a wish of going forth with the support of God. And God, goodbye is literally a shortening of God be with you. And so there's this deep kind of sense in Indian culture of a divinity that is shared by all beings, by all creatures. And namaste at times has been used to reference that as well. So it's a word like hello, but it's almost like a deeper hello. And then in the 1960s and the 1970s, so before I was born, but we of course have the amazing countercultural revolution in the United States and in Europe of many people who are fed up with capitalism and fed up with dominant culture and are looking for a deeper connection to themselves and other people and to the world. And that led a number of teachers, students, actually, they were young at the time. They've become master teachers in the years since, but led them to India, led them to Nepal, led them to Tibet, led them to Burma and Cambodia and Sri Lanka to study with great masters there. And they brought back the teachings, some teachings of yoga, some teachings of meditation and mindfulness, some rich, deep understanding of Buddhism. They also brought language back with them. And Ram Dass, in particular, of course, the great spiritual teacher, author of Be Here Now, he was one of the people who brought this word namaste back with him from India. And when he taught people in the late 60s and early 70s what namaste meant, it didn't just mean hello for him. It was much more of a greeting of the divine in ourselves, the divine in each other. So at one point he says that, namaste means the divine in me recognizes the divine in you. Or he says in a really beautiful phrase that when I say namaste, I acknowledge you from this place in which the universe dwells. The universe is inside of me, the universe is inside of you, and we're recognizing that when we say namaste to each other. And that deep, rich sense of namaste became very quickly associated with rising yoga culture. So yoga becomes much, much more popular in the 1990s and the 2000s. And a number of the teachers at the time who were most prominent were practicing namaste at the end of their classes and teaching their students that that was the way that we end a class of yoga. So you have this word that's been on a global journey. It's really quite interesting. And, technically for linguists, my background is in rhetoric, but I'm really close to both philosophy and linguistics. And linguists call it a loan word. So a word that we borrow from another language. And loan words, I think, are so cool because English has so many of them. So much of our language is borrowed from other languages. We borrowed a lot of words, actually, from Hindi and Sanskrit. Some loan words keep their meaning and they keep their spelling when they cross languages. Some loan words get a new spelling and they keep their meaning. Namaste kept its spelling and kept its pronunciation, though the word is pronounced in lots of different ways, just like any word around the world. But it gained this new meaning as it came into English. And I think that's really beautiful, actually. It's a really beautiful part of our yoga practice. And what I wanted to do in the book is basically to say, a lot of people say this word and they don't really understand the richness of the practice. But when we say it at the end of a yoga practice or the end of a meditation practice, it's not the end of our yoga practice. It's not the end of our meditation practice, but in fact, it's a bridge. It's a bridge from that formal practice time to life and to how we're living our lives.
Yeah. And also this part of the bridge is a remembering too, isn't it? To keep it with you, like you've got it in the wall. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, mindfulness, and mindfulness is remembering in the original language, correct? I mean, that's another word that I think in the translation kind of gets lost, perhaps.
Yeah. And so in Sanskrit, the word that we have come to translate as mindfulness is smriti. And in Pali, the word is sati. And you might not be able to tell, actually, on the wall behind me, I have a lot of things, I guess, on my walls that are really meaningful to me, but I have a calligraphy on my wall behind me that one of the nuns at Plum Village in France did for me. And it's the word sati, the word mindfulness, in Devanagari, in the script of Sanskrit or Pali. And it's in a circle representing infinity. And we talked about actually how that circle also represents namaste, a kind of infinity in which we're participating. But yes, so in those original languages, those words meant the practice of mindfulness. So the practice of being fully present in the moment. But they also both have the connotation of remembering. And I think that's interesting, actually, because mindfulness isn't, not to say it's not intellectual, right? You can't intellectualize mindfulness. Like, you have to practice it. And so if you understand mindfulness on an intellectual level, but you never actually experience it, you don't really understand it. It has to be practiced. It has to be embodied to really understand what it's about. So a lot of times mindfulness teachers are trying to steer us away from like mental concepts, actually. But remembering is a mental concept, very much. And so mindfulness means to remember to come back to the present moment so that we have little reminders that we give ourselves. A lot of people wear beads, mala beads. A lot of people don't know that, there's 108 on a string. Those mala beads are reminders. They're reminders of a mantra or a practice. But when you feel the mala beads against your chest or your shirt or on your wrist, it's a reminder to be mindful, to come back. So mindfulness is a practice of remembering to come back to the present moment when our minds wander off. But it's also a practice of remembering everything we've learned in our practice, all of the wisdom and insight that we've built. And so in the book, I wanted, and I do, I think, explore the practice of namaste, kind of starting with ourselves and then how we relate to other people and then how we live our lives. And I talk about 3 reminders of namaste in the book because we need to continue to remind ourselves to practice, to come back to that practice, to come back to what we've learned in our practice. It's almost like, I don't know if either of you have studied another language before, I'm sure. I've studied a few. I was really good at Spanish in high school, fluent. I spent a summer in Costa Rica, but I didn't practice it after that. And now it's gone. It's probably still in my head somewhere, actually. I think that the seeds are there. But if, someone speaks to me, I can understand a little bit. I can't articulate myself very well anymore. Mindfulness is like that, actually. We have to remind ourselves to continue to practice, because if we don't, we lose it. We forget. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it does. And as you're talking about mindfulness and the process of remembering, it's an interesting, it's a very interesting, potentially deeper process, and which you get into, I think, a little later on in the book. But it's right there in the beginning when you talk about the reminders, I am divine, you too are divine, live the word together. And I found myself wanting to ask you, where do you go with that word divine?
Yeah.
Because that's a really, it opens up a whole nother space, which I think you do a masterful job at keeping things concrete and staying in sort of cognitive emotional language. But you also open up into a whole nother sphere in the book in which you're really pointing to something other than thoughts and feelings. You're pointing to awareness itself.
Yeah.
But I wondered how, I thought it was kind of a bold choice. You just offered up divinity right in the very beginning. How do your students respond to that? What has been your experience with that, grappling with that word divinity?
Sure. It's interesting. Some of my friends who, my background, like I said, I'm a historian, I'm a rhetorician, I'm a philosopher. My friends who are in religious studies, who are part of that field, and I love the work that they do. They sometimes will say to me, wow, you just make a choice and just like go with it. And no one in our field would ever do that because it's so complicated and messy. And I'm like, yeah, that's what I did with divinity or divine. And, that word, I think a lot of times for a lot of people connotes something otherworldly, something supernatural. And I don't want to deny those experiences of divinity in the book at all. I think the more that we open ourselves up to experiences of things that are bigger than us, the better, actually. But when I talk about divinity or divine in the book, I wanted to make it really concrete. I wanted to make it really close to home and really close to our hearts. So a word that really means something in our daily lives. And so when I think of divinity, I'm thinking about both a powerful word that can be used to mark our lives, the lives of other people, the lives of all living beings as miraculous, as worthy of respect, as worthy of dignity, as worthy of care and compassion. I also wanted to draw our attention to this capacity that we all have for peaceful awareness, for peace, for mindful awareness. It's amazing, actually, that we have this ability as human beings when we're having an experience to step back and observe ourselves having that experience. The better that we're able to do that. And I don't really see that as being disassociating, actually. That's not what it feels like to me at all. You're still very much in the experience, but you become aware of reactivity. You become aware of your own conditioning. Someone says something to you and you feel the reaction arise in your mind and your body. But rather than just allowing it to follow through, you pause, you stop, you notice. In that space, I mean, Viktor Frankl said it really famously, right? That space between action and reaction is the space of freedom. And when I think of divinity, that's also what I'm thinking about, this just miraculous capacity that we have to observe ourselves having an experience, to pause, to notice, and then to make a choice about how we want to move forward. And so, there's this really famous metaphor, this image that's used twice in the Upanishads. And I often present this to my students and we talk about it. It's an image of two birds on a tree branch. And they're the same kind of bird. I'm looking outside right now. They might be, maybe cardinals. There's a lot of cardinals around in our yard right now. A lot of robins around as well. I've seen a few chickadees, but not as many as I normally do. Chickadees are just my favorite birds. I love chickadees. So let's say there are two chickadees on a tree branch. And one of them is like darting here and there, grabbing bugs, going after the fruit. It hears a sound and it's moving. It's very active, right? It's responding to reality. And the other chickadee, the other bird, is sitting on the branch, completely calm and just observing everything that's happening. For many people in the yoga world, for many of my friends who are Hindus, that represents the duality of like God and reality, right? Or the duality of like the divine and matter. And those two birds are separate, like they're two entities. For me, and for many of us who practice mindfulness, for many of us who work within more Buddhist or Zen traditions, they're not separate at all. Actually, they're both manifestations of the human experience. They're both parts of us. So it's not like you can wall off the peaceful bird and say it's separate from the world. The peaceful bird is part of the world. But somehow it's developed this capacity to be in peace. I hope that my book, the last book too, but I hope this one can help people to develop that capacity to be in peace. Because I think we'll make better decisions, but I think we'll also be better able to connect to other people if we're able to do that. And so in the yoga world, I find that people are pretty open to talking about the divine. Not always, actually. There's a lot of people who come to yoga and to spirituality because they've had really difficult experiences with organized religion, and they don't want to talk about any of it. In academia, I don't talk like with my students at Penn State. I don't talk about the divine as much, at least initially. I would talk about mindful awareness, and then at some point, I might tell my students that some people talk about this as divinity. And what do you all think about that? And what does that bring up for you? And so I turn it into an opportunity for collective consideration. And I think the students really appreciate that, actually.
I think they probably do. Yeah, being able to talk openly about those things.
Yeah,
It hasn't always been well received, even in academic circles. So I'm sure
absolutely.
that's really refreshing and for them to be able to do that with you.
It's
And
interesting in academia, just as a sidebar. At Penn State, where I work, we don't have a religious studies department or program. It was one that was excised, I don't know, 20 years ago in the name of financial efficiency. And I find it really interesting in the humanities and the liberal arts how reluctant we often are to talk about religion. It's such a big part of the human experience. Um, it requires a lot of skill to be able to talk about, I think, in ways that draw people into the conversation rather than alienating them. But I find that strange, actually. Sometimes my colleagues, if I want to talk about things like we're talking about today, just don't really want to have that conversation. They'll say, this is something for your private life, not for talking about here. And I want to say to them, well, our public lives are so deeply shaped by religion and religious language and religious values that it feels like a real disservice to our students if we're not talking about the kinds of things we're talking about today. I don't
I
know what you all think about that.
I so agree with you on that. I so agree with you on that. Um, uh, Students need a place where they can get out ideas from both directions.
Yeah.
Their particular unique religious approach, or the lack thereof, and then in the kind of greater context that says, okay, well, these are variables, these are parts of those experiences that we know about through our academic disciplines, and that these things can be talked about without necessarily just being dismissive in either direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Mike, did you have any thoughts about that?
Well, it's just, since the Enlightenment, that bifurcation came in of spirit and and other things, and really, I was thinking, the word remembering is so powerful because it's like remembering that there isn't a difference between the divine and the mundane. There is
Right.
no difference. It's the same. I mean, everything is. I mean, that's the whole point of
Yeah.
remembering.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you a question, Professor, about the word remembering itself, because I almost get that it's like you're bringing something back to your body. You're remembering, like there's a member and
Hmm.
bringing it back. So it's like it's not like an intellectual thing at all. It's a very physical, tactile thing of bringing it back into the divine back into you.
I think that's absolutely right. I think remembering starts as an intellectual practice, but it becomes an embodied practice as well. I think that's absolutely right. And that is an interesting, like if you think of remembering, right? Like gathering things that have become disjointed back together in the body. And it's interesting. I know in my own practice, my mindfulness practice, I sit every day That's kind of like recharging the batteries. But I find during the day these little moments where maybe I'm wandering off in my head. There's a reminder that happens to come back to what's happening in the present moment, but I'm not saying it to myself. It's not an intellectual reminder at all. It's something in the body. It's like something in the body feels a little bit off. And then I remember to come back, and that thing that felt off no longer feels off anymore. It's hard to talk about these things, isn't it? Because
It
I mean,
is.
it's like talking about the divine, or talking about God, or talking about embodied experience. The minute we put it into language, we've distanced ourselves from from the reality of things. So that wasn't the most articulate way of talking about it, but I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
But the word re itself, and again, I'll defer to you because I'm not a communications professor, but re is like an action word. And that's the whole thing too. This isn't a static idea. Ideas are kind of static, but this
Yeah.
is fluid and motion, and so you're bringing things back in. The remembering itself is a verb.
Yeah, I think that's right. Absolutely. Yeah, well said.
And namaste is that would be the equivalent of a verb too, or kind of, or
I almost understand it in the way that I understand like the word democracy. Democracy is a noun, but we have to understand it as a verb as well. And namaste is the same, actually. It's something close to a noun. It's more complicated than that. It's almost kind of like a gerund of a kind of, it's happening constantly in process. But we have to understand it as a verb, as a practice, I think. Yeah.
Well, and the practices we engage in that we don't necessarily think of as spiritual, sometimes you'll have this sort of awakening, if you will, where you're like, oh my goodness, this is the same experience that is being referenced in this whole other capacity of
Yes.
spirituality.
Yes.
Um, I learned at some point early in my career an approach to psychotherapy that involved um, what was called listening with a third ear. I don't know if you've
Hmm.
ever heard that term, but
No.
I'm going to block now on the theorist's name. It was the last name Reich, but I can't remember if it was Theodore Reich. But and I was puzzled by that. What does that mean to listen with the third ear? I mean, is that just being objective, or is it being something else? Is it a different way of listening? And over time, actually, in a variety of contexts of learning, I discovered what that meant. To be able to listen with the third ear, to pull back and hear things in a broader context, and to
Mm.
just go with that sort of flow. That much was revealed as much in the silence as there were in the words. And then it was a much later in life discovery that, oh my goodness, this is an opening that you
Mhm.
find, that you learn to live with in meditative practice, in
Yes.
some meditative practices. So it's
Mhm.
interesting how these things show up in different parts of our lives.
I yesterday was invited to a small town that's just outside of the college town where I live, to speak to the Unitarian Universalist community there in this little town. And it was lovely. There were, I don't know, 18 people or so. We sat in a circle. It was the first time I'd ever actually been to a Unitarian Universalist service. And I know some about the history of that practice. And, Emerson is one of my heroes, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so he's very much in that lineage as well. But it was beautiful. It was beautiful. I enjoyed talking about, I talked about my On Mindful Democracy book, and we cheered each other up a little bit, and that was nice. But looking at the words, the opening invocation and then the closing invocation, and I I believed wholeheartedly in all of these words, but they weren't my words. They were the words from a different tradition, but they were so similar to the practice of, meditation as I've come to experience it. And I think you're absolutely right. It's amazing, like these opportunities to connect with others. And I'm hopeful that is something that Namaste might open up for people as an opportunity to connect across traditions. I think there's so much more that unites us than divides us, and I think we're really only enemies in our minds.
Well, one of the really beautiful things about it, there are many beautiful things about your book, but one of the things that was very impressive to me was that you got your students to engage in a kind of learning exercise. You might want to just talk a little bit about that group exercise of having them go out into the world. I think it was human bumper cars.
Yep.
Do I have that? Human. And I thought, what a really creative, wonderful, simple, everyday experience example you were using, but you were asking them to engage in a practice.
Yeah. I think one thing that's fun, it's been interesting actually having 2 books come out in the span of 4 months. And that was not planned at all. That was just publication schedules. And Namaste was actually it was submitted 2 years ago, actually. Like it's taken almost 2 years for it to go from the final manuscript to publication. And so in that time, I wrote a whole nother book and published a whole nother book. And so the On Mindful Democracy book came out 4 months ago, but it was written after Namaste. And so it's been fun to go back to this Living Namaste project to be inspired by it again. But to notice some of the differences between the 2 books. I mean, the 2 books are very much akin. I wrote both of them. But this Living Namaste book is actually in some ways more practical, and it's also more personal. There's a lot of me in this book. Stories from my life and where my practices come from, but also stories from the classroom and my students and how much they've inspired me. And so I was trying to come up with a assignment that I could give my students that would get them off of their phones and help them to be more present around other people. And in mindfulness meditation, there's a meditation that we often do. I know it through Jack Kornfield and Tara Brach, but others have variations of this meditation. They call it the intensely frustrating line meditation. I love this meditation. And it's very frustrating because it's in the name. But the idea is when you find yourself in a situation that's really, really, really frustrating to you, stuck in a line at the grocery store at 5:30 after work, and you're hungry and there's 10 people in front of you and everybody's paying with a check. I mean, like that's like the situation. Or you're stuck in traffic trying to get to work, trying to get home from work. All the lights are red. Somebody's not paying any attention because they're on their phone and they miss the turn signal. You all know the situations, right? Those are the perfect times to practice mindfulness, to remember to come back to our breath, to feel our feet underneath us, and to just notice those feelings of frustration as they arise. And rather than like projecting them onto other people or spinning stories about how awful everyone in the world is and how they can't drive or they can't, do whatever. Just letting all of that go and just being and taking those opportunities as opportunities just to be in the moment, to see what happens. My students don't often go to the grocery store. A lot of them don't drive because they're just on campus. And so I was trying to think of an experience that might be something like that for them. And I was walking between classes at Penn State. And my town is a very small town. I don't know, 60,000 people, something like that. But during the school year, that more than doubles with the number of students. It's a giant university. It's a huge footprint, but so many students. And so between classes, it really does feel like you're in, Times Square on a Friday night. It's, it only lasts for about 15 minutes, but it's a lot. And I was walking between classes thinking about what assignment I was going to do for my students. And some student bumped right into me with a full cup of coffee and spilled it all over me. Uh, and I felt the reaction arise in me, and I practiced enough to stop. And, and the student was so apologetic. But they also were paying no attention to anything that was going on around them. And I thought, this would be a good assignment for my students. So I built it into this semester-long project of asking my students to keep a journal and once a day to commit to practicing mindful walking, to walk from one class to another mindfully without any distractions. And then to notice every time someone bumped into them or every time they bumped into someone, notice what happened. What thoughts arose, what feelings arose, what words arose, and then to write that down in their journal. And at the beginning of the semester, it's hilarious just reading these reflections from my students. It's so funny. Because they get so mad at people are bumping into them, and students will write in big capital letters curse words, and they're not shy about sharing that kind of stuff with their professor. It's amazing. But after practicing for mindfulness for 3 or 4 weeks and just doing this once a day for 3 or 4 weeks, there's this really subtle shift that happens in their journals. They stop getting so upset because they notice like those feelings of being upset arising, and they choose not to act on them. They realize that actually what they were taking very personal, and they all take it personal at the beginning of the semester. How could they bump into me? I mean, it's me. How could someone bump into me? Why would you ever do that? What a-hole, whatever. I mean, they have lots of creative ways of saying that. They realize after a few weeks, it's not personal at all. It's just other people who also aren't paying attention. And at some point, many of the students make that connection. They recognize that actually the people bumping into them aren't bad people. They're not malicious. They're just not mindful yet. And a lot of the students wake up to this realization that actually at the beginning of the semester, they weren't very mindful either. They hadn't tapped into this inner divinity. Other people haven't tapped into it yet, but it doesn't mean that they're not also divine, that they're not also capable of practicing this. And so it opens up a new understanding and experience of their fellow beings. And that assignment, I've been doing it for several years now. It's the one probably more than, the movie credit meditation in this book is the one that the students come back to over and over and over again. They say that one changes their lives. But this one is one students will write me back about a year or 2 years later, and they'll say, I was going to the football game and somebody bumped into me with a full beer, and I was about to yell at them, and I remembered, no, human bumper cars. And they remembered it in their body, and that made a real difference for them. And so, I don't know, I like that practice a lot. Thanks for asking about it.
No, I loved it when I read it. I thought it was everything an assignment like that should be. It was simple. It was straightforward. It was something that was going to encounter. They were going to encounter naturally. It was just perfect. And the thing that I found most powerful about it was that, as you described your students' reactions and how they did follow that, they did try to do that, and that you were opening a door. I thought this is quite a credit. I know that you mentioned Thich Nhat Hahn as having a huge influence in your life, and I thought, what a credit this is. What an honor that is to him that you
Mm.
pursued this in that way. That um, that is opening a door to that listening with the third ear for them, the
Yeah.
pulling back and watching their own reactions.
Yeah.
I just thought it was very masterful, as was the film credits, which I don't want to give away all of your book by dragging you into a discussion of that, because I really think this is a book worth buying. But I thought that too was incredibly. It's at once humbling and an honor at the same time. I thought it was a beautifully crafted exercise for the students. So thank
Thanks.
you for that.
Thanks. Oh yeah. Yeah. That some people have asked me what my favorite thing that I've written is. And I think it's the middle two chapters of this book, actually. The movie credit meditation and then the Whitman meditation, the Book of Ands. And I love Walt Whitman. I've been thinking about him so much with the upcoming 250th anniversary, and just his expansive sense of self and the way that cultivated such deep humility and openness and compassion to other people. And if anything I write could capture even like 5% of his wisdom, I would be really happy with that, actually. So, yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking about your just discussion of human bumper cars and your earlier discussion of the two birds and the difference that they were relating to reality. And you had one bird that was on hyper vigilant, aware of everything being threatened, and the other one was just taking it in. And I was wondering, I'm probably projecting what humans can do, but the one bird that has more equanimity is almost feeling that there's nothing threatening there because it's all interconnected. Or you just said expanded sense of self of Whitman. And I wonder if that's, a way kind of to bring in a little bit of a naturalist view of this, perhaps.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I think that often our sense, I want to say that there are real threats in the world, right? There are people who are really threatened. And that is just a reality of things. But it's also the case that many of us feel a deep sense of threat in situations in which that threat does not exist. And I think that comes from a sense of separation, a sense of loneliness and isolation, a sense of opposition. And I think one of the most beautiful things about practicing mindfulness, about practicing meditation, about practicing yoga, about spiritual practice is that sense of reunification, right? That sense of recovering our interconnectedness, our interdependence, because if we don't feel so alone or isolated, I don't think we feel as threatened, actually. And so it's interesting that I hadn't really thought of the two birds in that way, but I think you're right.
Yeah, well, and it's kind of different because it's almost like a next phase of maybe human evolution, almost. And then I shouldn't go there, but it's something about that, like animals, they have to be hyper vigilant, and we kind of don't because we're in safe spaces. So therefore, we can do something different, maybe, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, it's also, at least partly, I'm looking at my backyard here during the pandemic. I ripped out our entire backyard. It's not a giant yard, but it was a lot of work. And we back up to a little forest. But I ripped out the entire yard and planted a pollinator garden in the backyard. And then over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, I've been slowly transitioning that, adding in some Japanese maples because I do bonsai trees. That's one of my practices. And so we have this little arboretum in our backyard now, a nice deck where we practice yoga. And I feel very blessed by that. But we have so many critters and birds and there was this little, I was sitting out this morning meditating, and there was this little chipmunk, and he was running around on the ground. And he saw me and he paused, and he squeaked a little bit and he ran back under the deck. And then he popped his head back out, and I didn't move at all. I'm just noticing him. And he saw me again, and he squeaked and he ran under the deck. And then he came back out and he looked at me and he just went away. And then I closed my eyes and I opened him up, and he was right in front of me on the deck, just looking at me. And I said to him, "Hi, little chipmunk. I'm no threat to you." And he just didn't. I mean, it felt like, and again, I might be projecting, right? It felt like that little chipmunk realized it was safe. That this person posed it absolutely no threat whatsoever. And then he just went on his day. I think part of what we have to do if we're talking about like a next phase of democracy, a next phase of evolution, a more just, joyous, less painful world, is build communities where people really feel safe.
Yeah.
Where we can
Absolutely.
be that bird sitting in equanimity, and to do that for each other. And I think one of the beautiful things about practicing in a community with others is that the burden of remembering doesn't just fall on us. Like, we can help each other to remember, to come back to our practice, to cultivate this practice. But it's really in community that we can take care of each other. It's really in community that we realize that we aren't alone, not just in an intellectual way, but in a deep embodied way. So that's partly why the book ends by thinking about community a little bit more. Yeah. We should do a show and invite some other people on the two birds.
Exactly. And the other thing is like with you and the chipmunk or the birds, I think silence and stillness sort of puts a container that either humans or chipmunks feel less threatened. There's something about stillness, either in other humans or in nature, that means it's not a threat. It's only when you're when it's fast-paced movement, there's something about those vibrations that sort of trigger emotional responses in people. And so to cultivate, like you said, the inner stillness, and to see the inner stillness in me and you, and we're all together. I mean, that's just all very comforting. It's very comforting, soothing.
Yeah. I've noticed in my own practice of human bumper cars on campus, and again, this is just me, so it's just anecdotal experience, but I've noticed there's a difference if I'm rushing and I'm walking really fast between classes versus if I'm walking really slow and mindfully. And I've noticed that if I'm walking really slow and mindfully, nobody runs into me. And I don't know why. I'm much more likely to have people run into me if I'm like walking frantically. And again, I don't know. Maybe it's that same kind of stillness thing that we respond to peace with peace. I don't know. I'd like to think that's true. That'd be nice.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. It makes me think of the notion of spaciousness, which
Mm.
is kind of my favorite word. Mike is going to roll his eyes. There she goes again. But but um, when we're quieter, when we're doing things more thoughtfully, perhaps a bit slower than we might otherwise be doing them, um, there can be a quality of spaciousness in our experience. And it would be interesting to think about how that is perceived
Mhm.
by other people. If there is that quality that somehow they sense as well when they're in a more peaceful environment around people who are more grounded and um, moving a bit more slowly, more
Hmm.
thoughtfully. Yeah.
I think of loving kindness meditation, metta meditation. I often describe it, and I don't think I'm unique here. I'm sure that I picked this up from other great teachers I've had the privilege of studying with. But thinking about that practice of extending loving well wishes of safety and support and health and community and care to yourself and to others is almost like expanding your heart space.
Yes.
And you know, I often think about, like, when we have suffering or we have hurt, it's not like we're shrinking that suffering or hurt, but we're expanding the container in which it's held, um, so that it no longer seems so powerful. And I feel like that's what we often are doing in meditation practice, is expanding that space in which we hold things. And maybe we do that as communities as well, even more. Maybe that's part of the power of community, is to amplify that expansion of the space in which we hold ourselves and others. I don't know. I feel like our conversation today has really opened up some really interesting new avenues to continue to kind of think and work in this area. That's really fun.
Yeah, it certainly has. It certainly has on my side as well. Reading your book, it has pointed out some ways in which I hadn't thought about applications um, of meditative practice or of mindfulness, and some beautifully creative avenues for that. And so I thank you for that. But yeah, I feel the same way.
Well, next time you go on sabbatical, we'll have to do a mindful walk with you, like the Buddhist monks did here recently in the United States. We can
Oh,
do
wow.
that.
Wasn't that beautiful?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, wow. That was so beautiful. Yeah, they're doing that in, I think in India soon, or
Ah,
right now,
okay,
actually. Yeah, which is amazing. But I would love that opportunity. That'd be great.
Yeah, maybe we can go
wonderful.
do that to bring some stillness and silence to areas that are hyper vigilant right now in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, poor things. Um, well, is there anything that, speaking of that, I know you've since I follow you on Instagram and other places, you're on tour or have been on
Yeah.
tour with other books. Is there any events that people can connect with you coming up for you?
Sure. One that's coming up, I'll be down in Washington, D.C. on July 1st. I'm talking about my other book on mindful democracy, but I'm going to be leading a community reading of the Declaration of Interdependence. And it's at Busboys and Poets, which is a really amazing bookstore just right downtown. And then there's some events that are coming up in the fall but haven't been confirmed yet. So I think I'm going to be talking about Living Namaste at the Boulder bookstore in Boulder, Colorado. And I think I'll also be doing a trip up to New Hampshire and Massachusetts to talk about my Mindful Democracy book, doing an event at the Cambridge Public Library that's going to be sponsored by the Harvard School of Public Health and the Thich Nhat Hahn Center there. And so there's some events coming up, and it looks like I'm going to be doing a retreat at Kripalu in Massachusetts as well next year. It'll probably be about a year from now, and it'll be on practices of connection. And so we'll have a chance to delve deeper into some of these practices from this book and the other book. And I'm very excited about that opportunity to practice and learn from others in person.
Oh, that sounds like a road trip for us, Lynn.
Hey, that would be great.
I'm up for it.
Sure.
I'm up for it.
That'd be wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Professor. If people are interested in getting more information about you and all that you do, where would be good places for them to connect with you?
We can definitely check out my website, jeremydavidengels.com. I've got a Substack called Zen and the Art of Democracy that has been somewhat neglected because I've been traveling so much, but I'm going to pick that back up again this summer. And I'm also somewhat on Instagram and Blue Sky. I should pay more attention to those than I do because it's nice to connect on those platforms, but you can find me on them as well. And I would love the opportunity to connect to listeners if you're interested. And you can find the book at your local bookseller, probably online at your favorite place to buy books as well.
We both wish you best of luck. Namaste, Professor.
Namaste. Thank you.